Thank you, Steve.
Van Impe had a tough night in Philadelphia that night. Much to the pleasure of Red Barrington and the St. Louis Blues. Steve, thank you very much for the remarks. My contract is up next year, so you could be my agent next year, I'll tell you. Right, Tom?
We'll be calling Mr. Stillman.
Yes, good. I'm honored to accept this award for my father. And also here tonight with me is my family, part of our family that lives in St. Louis. My mother, Fran, my sister, Kathy, my sister, Susan, and my sister, Ann, and her husband, Brad. Why don't you guys stand up? And before I start my remarks, I just want to go off script real quick. Steve mentioned the great Al Arbour, who passed away yesterday at 82. He was the Blues' first captain. Twice he was the coach of the St. Louis Blues, and arguably one of the greatest coaches in the history of the NHL. 2 records that will stand forever, in my mind. His teams with the Islanders won 19 consecutive playoff series. 19. He also coached the Islanders for 1,500 games in succession. He was an awesome man. He was a great coach and an even better man, and Al Arbour passed away yesterday at age 82. Let's have a toast to Al Arbour. To Al. Al Arbour, great man. And he was a great friend of my father's, a great friend. I know my dad would like to congratulate all the other Hall of Famers who are being honored tonight, including, of course, Mr. Stillman. I know the Blues are in great hands with you, Tom, and your local ownership group, and I feel in my heart a Stanley Cup is in the near future of the St. Louis Blues. And I know all these people here would love that. And also the other inductees. As a former amateur player, I can vouch that some of these great coaches were great coaches. They benched me. They were very smart people. And I was made to look silly by some of these players on the ice, like Mike Robin. So a very, very worthwhile group of players and executives here tonight. As many of you are aware, this is not the first time my dad has been elected to a Hall of Fame. Shortly after he passed away in 1989, he was honored by the Hockey Hall of Fame. He was also given the Lester Patrick Award for his contributions to the game of hockey in the U.S. He has also been inducted into the Ottawa Sports Hall of Fame, his hometown, and last year was elected into the St. Louis Sports Hall of Fame. While all the awards and honors are appreciated and incredibly flattering, this induction tonight is unique and special for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's obviously an award that's given to St. Louisans, and I can tell you without question that my dad was incredibly proud to be from St. Louis. Although he grew up in Ottawa, Ontario, he launched his Hall of Fame career in Canada. It was here in St. Louis for 21 years that I feel he did his greatest work. And it didn't matter if he was broadcasting the Blues game, a national game for the NHL, working on football or baseball games. He was always known as Dan Kelly from St. Louis. And believe me when I say this, Dan Kelly loved the St. Louis Blues and loved the city of St. Louis. This award is also special because of my dad's love of the game of hockey and, of course, amateur hockey here in St. Louis. I know when we first moved here in 1968, there were only a few rinks in the city and a few programs. I know when I played high school hockey and junior B in the late 70s, a few of the top players might get a chance to play Division III college hockey. And now today, countless young men and women are playing at many of the top programs in the country, and of course, a few have made it all the way to the NHL, including current Blues Paul Stastny and Chris Butler. I know my dad and all of you folks here in this room tonight are very proud of the tremendous growth in amateur hockey here in St. Louis. I first learned of my dad's induction into this Amateur Hockey Hall of Fame last year when Steve Dionetta surprised me on the air of a Blues game with the announcement that my dad would be inducted in 2015. Although I was surprised and honored by the announcement, my first thought is, why was my dad a worthy candidate? As you know, Dan Kelly didn't play or coach amateur hockey. He wasn't an executive. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood. For many St. Louisans, they learned about the Blues and the game of hockey from my father. I can't tell you how many times in my life that I've been told this exact story. When I was a kid, I first listened to a Blues game on the radio, and I fell in love with the St. Louis Blues. As a matter of fact, I first listened on a little transistor radio in my bed at night, listening to Dan Kelly and Gus Kyle. I have been told that story hundreds and hundreds of times, and it never gets old. So for those people who first listened back in 1968 and became fans of the Blues and fell in love with the game and their team, and those people had children, they played the game, they followed the Blues, and now their kids are doing the same thing. And for a lot of these people, the love affair goes back generations, starting with their parents listening to my dad with that transistor radio in their bed at night. And for the record, I did the exact same thing every night. My dad's love for the Blues and the game of hockey was unsurpassed. As a kid, I can remember tagging along with him as he went and spoke at a hockey banquet. Or it might be after a Blues game when I'd wait for him outside the Blues locker room next to the Arena Club, and he'd walk out of the locker room, would walk to the car. He'd always have plenty of time to sign autographs and talk about the Blues and to all the fans that would come up to him. But probably the best example that I can come up with to show his dedication to the game of hockey and the Blues was on November 17th, 1988. A few months prior to that, he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he continued to work. At the time, I was a broadcaster for the New York Rangers on radio. And ironically enough, the Rangers played in Philly on November 15th, 2 days before this game. So my dad called me up and said, why don't you stay over and you can spend some time with me and come to the game and sit with me. So of course I did. So, and again, he was very ill at the time. We got to the Spectrum in Philadelphia, went to the press room, and then there was no elevator to the press box. So I walked with him up the stairs. It was about 10 flights. He would walk about 10 steps, he'd rest. He'd walk another 10 steps, he'd rest. And he finally made it to the top. And I was just in amazement. Like, this man did not need to be here that night. He did not need to walk up all these stairs. But he was so dedicated to his job, the St. Louis Blues, the game of hockey, that he wanted to be there. A couple of footnotes about that night. The Blues won the game that night 3-1 in Philadelphia on November 17th, 1988. It was their first win in Philadelphia since January 6th of 1972. They broke a long drought. That night, my dad's last ever road game as a broadcaster for the St. Louis Blues. And that night they won in 72 was the night of the big brawl when the fans attacked Al Arbor after the period. And then they went all those years and they never won a game. I also broadcast the second period that night with my father. It was the only time I ever broadcast a game with him. And as I said, it was the last game he ever broadcast on the road. He did 2 more games, and then he could not do any more games. So that, to me, proved his dedication and love, and I'll always remember that night for the rest of my life. That is etched in my memory, and again, I want to thank, on behalf of our family here tonight, the committee and everyone else here in attendance for this incredible honor. My father has been inducted into many Hall of Fames, but believe me when I say this one is very special. Thank you very much.